You are welcome for the second plenary session. Intercultural communication, as we know well, is prone to misunderstandings and breakdowns. The first plenary speech today by Michał B. Paradowski and colleague Elżbieta Pawlas presents the results of research on these problems, including what the causes are, how problems can be prevented, and what remedial strategies can be used. Professor Paradowski is an associate professor at University of Warsaw, Faculty of Applied Linguistics, teacher and translator trainer, author of many papers and several books in the field of language acquisition, corpus linguistics, multilingualism, and English as a lingua franca. Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for attending, everyone. So I guess that no one here needs explaining that the English language today has status of lingua franca in most corners of the world. And according to different estimates, the number of non-native users constitutes around 4/5 of all the speakers of the language. And that proportion is expected to go even higher over the next couple of decades. And this has at least two consequences, one being that this language is no longer shaped exclusively by its native users, and the other being that for many learners, the only communication that they may have with native speakers may be in the classroom, and then they might be using the language outside, but with other non-native users like themselves. So what happens with the English language today is processes of adaptation, spread, variation that you find in other languages, and those are obviously natural processes. But what distinguishes English from some other languages is that here they are accelerated by non-native users as well. Of course, we know that there are huge disproportions in the different languages of the world and how many people speak them. Here are just some statistics from the European Union. And if we just look at first language speakers, then English is not the most spoken there. It's on a par with French and behind German. But if you add people who can communicate in the language, irrespective of their background as a native or non-native user, then we see that English in the European Union is spoken by twice as many people as the runner-up, and that's German. Of course, the ratios of proficiency and fluency in the language in different countries differ considerably, but it's still a fact. It's naturally a bit more difficult to evaluate the numbers of speakers globally, but there have been such attempts, and again, English is at the top up there. The numbers are similar to those of Mandarin Chinese, the difference, of course, being that with Mandarin Chinese, you can get mileage in China, Taiwan, Singapore, a few other countries, and also pockets of immigrants, but otherwise it doesn't really enable you to communicate further than that. So what's been happening since the 16th century is this process of English language gaining a foothold in more and more places. But what's important today is that the main reason for learning it for most learners is to interact primarily with other non-native users. And this can find a reflection in the perception of this language. For instance, Katja Lochtmann carried out an interesting study at Vrije Universiteit Brussels, asking students about their connotations and associations with different languages. And she found that most European languages had connotations. So French was associated with Romanticism, German with Ordnung, but the English language didn't carry any connotations or associations for the students, because the students consider this language as a means of communication with their classmates, with instructors, with tourists, or when they themselves were traveling. So while in the past English would single you out in the world and would be a marker of status if you spoke it as a language other than your L1, today we are relegated to the minority if we do not speak the language, and this is also sometimes reflected in educational policies, for instance, in content and language integrated learning, where English is no longer treated as a separate subject in the curriculum. So this development is something that has been predicted in the past for various reasons, not necessarily the ones that made English get where it is today. And it also means that it's used and being used in places where you might not expect it or might not desire it. For instance, on school exchange trips, whose purpose is to make the children speak the languages of the country that they go to. For instance, if German students go to Italy or vice versa, to the frustration of many teachers, the pupils will often switch into English rather than the language that they are supposed to be speaking. And then, of course, in the European Union, English became one of the working languages on the accession of Austria, Finland, and Sweden, none of them being a native English-speaking country. So, of course, one might wonder what is going to happen with English in the European Union today after Brexit, but probably the ship has sailed and the language is there to stay. So we're probably going to be more and more exposed to situations, maybe such as this one.
Excuse me. Sorry, do you speak English?
No, I don't, sorry.
Oh. My car's broken down and I wondered if you could tell me where to find a garage.
Well, you know, that's wasted on me. I don't understand what you're saying.
You don't speak any English at all?
Not a word, no. It's one of those things where I wish I paid more attention in school, but, excuse me, sorry. Do you speak any English?
English? No. What's the problem?
I don't know, I can't understand it.
Hi, my car's broken down and I need to find a garage.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't understand that at all.
All right, well, thanks.
So anyway, if you go down that way, about half a mile, there's a village. There might be somebody there that speaks English.
Right, well, too bad about that. So, English as a lingua franca, sometimes also referred to as English as an international language, refers to use of English among speakers of different mother tongues. Now, if you looked at the literature from 1 or 2 decades ago, then this would typically refer to communication among non-native and non-native speakers, but modern current literature also recognizes the possibility of native speakers also engaging in ELF communication, as long as they make the attempt to understand the interlocutor and take the effort to make themselves understood. So the concept and idea of English as lingua franca calls into question the notions of proper, real, or standard English, which are idealized, reified notions, where many reference grammars, for instance, Randolph Quirk's Comprehensive Grammar of the English Language, 1889 pages, is more or less this thick. It's just grammar, no exercises there. There are things and items in that book that native speakers will not know about. There are many things and linguistic behaviors exhibited by native speakers that will not be in that reference grammar. And of course, I'm not even thinking of substandard or so-called substandard varieties here. And obviously, this also brings up the notion of language variety and the fact that many forms that are not considered appropriate in the classroom are fully legitimate forms in different dialects and varieties of the English language, and native speakers would never or rarely be told of or be told that they are not native speakers if they exhibited those, but we frequently encounter double standards when we move to the context of an English language classroom. The reason, of course, is that the English language today has no single source. You have the national varieties, and then within each country you have often more than one variety. Regionally, not always mutually comprehensible. So you have cases, multiple cases, where native speakers do not understand other native speakers, and sometimes this can actually result in police presence, as in this case when a passenger on a flight from Australia to the US who used an Australian expression was thought by the flight attendant that she was using an offensive expression. Here's another instance again of a language that gets you in trouble, even though you're just speaking a different variety of your national language. Here it's not even a matter of two different national varieties. So of course this presents the dilemma of which model to choose in the language classroom. And if you're from Europe, then this will frequently be received pronunciation. The problem with received pronunciation is that already a few decades ago, it was assessed to be spoken by fewer than 3% of the British population. So this means that if you choose it as a model for your students, you could be accused of teaching your students something that does not really exist. And you could find a reflection of those changes if you looked at phonetic analysis of the speech of Queen Elizabeth II, and if you looked at the changes in the BBC, for instance, let alone British schools. Another frequent choice is Standard American, given that it's the US that boasts the highest number of native speakers of English today. But again, if you took a look at a map of American dialects, it might look a little like a Jackson Pollock painting. And please note that Standard American by no means, or so-called Standard American by no means occupies a majority of the US territory and is by no means spoken even by half of Americans. So that certainly presents a problem if you wish to go for a native speaker variety, but still in the literature and in folk beliefs today, you have to fight with the so-called linguistic imperialism and the idea that it's the native speakers that own the English language and are authorities in the English language, and the accompanying expectation that anything other than that is going to be treated as errors. I've mentioned the notion language variety a few times, and it's important here to emphasize that English as a lingua franca is not a variety of English. Because a language variety is an ethnopolitical and sociocultural construct that refers to language spoken in a certain geographical area, and typically also by people sharing some more common denominators, whereas English as lingua franca by definition refers to the English that emerges in communication between two persons, at least one of whom has moved out of their primary speech communities. Because it's either that someone comes over from another country, another culture to yours, or you go from yours to the other and use the English language as a bridge. So instead of using language variety, if we want to refer to a common denominator among speakers of English as a lingua franca, it's better to speak of communities of practice, or sometimes discourse communities. So the aim of ELF interactions is being communicatively efficient, and this is achieved by accommodating to the interlocutor. and importantly, it's different from grammatical correctness. So frequent trademarks that you find in successful ELF interactions are redundancy, over-regularization, the use of different languages, intertwined in the English, repetition, paraphrase, innovations. So to make this a bit more tangible, you frequently find lack of the third person singular present s, dropping the ing ending, omitting plurals or pluralizing nouns that are believed or thought uncountable, or different uses of the articles. Now, if you looked at this list, you might be thinking, oh, it's all very well, but this is just an inventory of some of frequent mistakes that learners make. Yes, but the difference between these and some other mistakes in English is that if these happen, communication typically proceeds uninterrupted and understanding still takes place. Whereas there are other aspects of the English language where if violations of the norms take place, communication breaks down. And when I move to the experimental part, empirical part, I will show some examples there. Researchers have been trying to find the common denominator of what is really necessary for successful communication in the English language as a lingua franca. And Jenkins came up in the realm of pronunciation with what she called the lingua franca core. So those aspects of English pronunciation that are crucial for international intelligibility. Here we find consonants except the interdentals, the and the, that are often problematic for learners. And Jenkins found that actually replacing interdentals with a close sound, for instance, th or td, as they do in Ireland, is typically unproblematic because the context helps disambiguate. And it also helps students because in some cultures it's considered impolite to be seen with your tongue sticking between your teeth. Of course, it really depends what you replace the sounds with, because it's not that anything goes.
Das hier ist mein Sektor. Das hier ist das wichtigste Gerät des Küstenwächters. Das Gerät und das Gerät. Überlebensradar.
Mayday, mayday. Hello, can you hear us? Can you hear us? Can you... Over. We are sinking. We are sinking.
Hello? This is the German Coast Guard.
We are sinking. We're sinking.
What are you thinking about?
Right, so you typically want to know what you can replace sounds with. Some other findings from Jenny Jenkins' research was that approximations of consonants were accepted as long as it was obvious that it was this consonant and not another one. So whether you pronounce t with the tip of your tongue, at the tip of your teeth, or at the base of your teeth, or between your teeth, or on the alveolar ridge, doesn't matter as long as it's obvious that it's a t. Aspiration was important. Clusters pose problems to many speakers, and what often happens is that speakers of the English language as a non-native language try to simplify by, for instance, dropping some consonants. This doesn't really work, but what works is adding a mini vowel, for instance, a schwa, in between the consonants to break up the cluster, and then that works fine. In terms of vowels, length is important, but the exact quality of the vowel or the place of articulation no longer so. And then in terms of prosody, whether you stress the word on the first syllable or the penultimate syllable or the last syllable didn't matter. What mattered was that focal stress was maintained. So outside the core, so those items that were not necessary for international intelligibility, we find a production of interdentals, vowel quality, weak forms. Weak forms are very damaging to intelligibility. Of course, if your students are going to speak with native speakers or highly proficient speakers, then they have to be exposed to weak forms in order to understand speech, but they do not necessarily have to pronounce them. Epenthesis, perfectly fine. Word stress, rhythm, those are things that do not really matter for international intelligibility. Yet if you think back to your own classes, you might think of the time that was spent on these areas and whether that was necessarily the best distribution of classroom time. So what happens is that often those non-native-like behaviors are actually more comprehensible than so-called standard English. Let's listen to a brief parliamentary debate in the UK.
Mr. Speaker, I know from speaking to a number of parliamentary colleagues that there are still certain aspects of the estate, including the Northern Estate, that are not great for people with disabilities. Can I ask the honourable gentleman what work is being done to make sure that this place is more accessible, particularly for some of our colleagues who have a disability?
Here, here.
I'm sorry, it must be something to do with my Antipodean background. Could you please repeat the question, because I didn't follow it?
Well, very popular today. I'm saying that a number of parliamentary colleagues who have disabilities do find it quite difficult getting around certain parts of the state. Given that we're doing this refurbishment work, what can be done to make sure that those with a disability are able to move around more freely and the place is accessible?
I'm really sorry. Please, could you do it very slowly in an Antipodean English? Thank you.
Just give any old answer.
I think the answer might be helped if you can reply in writing when you're read. Right, Chris?
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'll try it on the first go. Can I? Because I'm Welsh, so God help him.
Right, so David Linder represents Yorkshire. Paul Beresford resided in New Zealand for a long time, and he has a hard time understanding his parliamentary colleague. And that's the way that David Linden summarized his experience later that day on Twitter. Now let's, for comparison, listen to another politician who is not a native speaker.
I believe that against ignorance, we have education. Against the threats on the planet, science. I believe in building a better future for our children, which requires offering them a planet that is still habitable in 25 years. Some people think that securing current industries and their jobs is more urgent than transforming our economies to meet the global challenge of climate change. I hear these concerns, but we must find a smooth transition to a low-carbon economy. By polluting the oceans, not mitigating CO2 emissions, and destroying our biodiversity, we are killing our planet. Let us face it, there is no planet B. And I'm sure one day the United States will come back and join the Paris Agreement. And I'm sure let me say we have two possible ways ahead. We can choose isolationism, withdrawal, and nationalism. This is an option. It can be tempting to us as a temporary remedy to our fears. But closing the door to the word will not stop the evolution of the word. It will not douse but inflame the fears of our citizens. We have to keep our eyes wide open to the new risks right in front of us. I'm convinced that if we decide to open our eyes wider, we will be stronger. We will overcome the dangers. We will not let the rampaging work of extreme nationalism shake a world full of hopes for greater prosperity. Personally, if you ask me, I do not share the fascination for new strong powers, the abandonment of freedom, and the illusion of nationalism.
So, of course, if you listen to Macron, you probably noticed a few aspects of his pronunciation that could do with an improvement, and one or two of them was actually within the lingua franca core, but probably most non-native speakers would understand him much better than David Linden, for instance. While we can get away without some aspects of native pronunciation, this also means that successful interaction and also classroom instruction ought to include training interaction strategies, negotiation for meaning, building rapport, intercultural and accommodation skills, and learning what is appropriate and what is the norm in the small environment that our students are going to navigate, rather than the broad notion of the target country. So the results that I will be presenting briefly come from the Vienna-Oxford International Corpus of English, where we broke down the corpus into a section zooming on all the conversations in that collection. And you've got a brief rundown here, looking at the causes of communication breakdowns, the strategies that were used as preventative strategies, and also those that were remedial ones. So in the subcorpus, we detected 122 cases of communication breakdowns. And here we can see the main causes thereof. And one of the things that I'd like to draw your attention to is the second row up there, which says wrong word order or wrong tenses. Because this shows again that it's not that successful English as lingua franca means anything goes, because if you get the tense wrong or if you get the word order wrong, of course, depending on the context, communication may break down. So this still means that there is place for grammar in the English language classroom. A few examples here illustrating the different scenarios. So here we can see how lack of explicitness leads to a misunderstanding. So this was a conversation where a Maltese family were showing the sites to a Serbian student, and this has been going on for a while. So when the student says that's something new to me, and they were looking at a castle wall, they first think that that is a deictic expression relating to what they're seeing at the moment, whereas she's referring to what she has been seeing all morning. Here we can see a situation where the word order was responsible for a communication breakdown. And in this exchange, it is not even clear at which point, if at all, speaker 4 comes to understand the question, because at some point she withdraws from the conversation completely. So it may be that she did not understand the question at all. Then there were, of course, remedial strategies that were often employed immediately after the communication breakdown was noticed. And in some cases, it would take several turns to fix the original expression and to get the interlocutor to understand the message. And in most cases, the remedial strategies were fairly straightforward. So most of them could be summed up as enhancing explicitness, and in some cases it was enough just to repeat or paraphrase the message and then it was understood. For instance, in some cases it could have been that the communication channel was just noisy. Again, some examples here. Here we can see both lexical and grammatical paraphrase of the original question. This is a conversation in a restaurant where the first speaker asks the interlocutor how long they have been since their arrival in Vienna, and the Italian students initially understands the question to be about their time in the restaurant, and takes a few turns to resolve this misunderstanding. Here we can see an exchange where you see the speaker using different kinds of metadiscursive expressions. So it's also useful to introduce those in the language classroom in order to narrow down the different possible interpretations and to disambiguate what she meant by date online. And we can see that sometimes speakers are really involved and engaged in trying to resolve miscommunication issues. Here we can see that this has been taking a few turns of different stages of paraphrase and rephrasing. And finally, there are preventative strategies, so strategies employed by speakers when they believe that the message may already be misunderstood before they produce it. And here's one instance of a conversation between computer scientists where speaker 6 explains the different circumstances of work at the university in Germany, and they use topicalization and resumptive pronouns to segment the information and to make it more comprehensible and clear. So it's important to understand that English as a lingua franca is not a set of reduced forms or bastardized English, and that it's got little to do with the attempts at language planning. Of course, we know very well some constructed languages that were invented, whether for international communication or, for instance, for entertainment. Here the names that are provided in gray font are the names of linguists that were hired by the production companies to help develop languages so that the languages would follow the rules of natural languages. And there were also attempts in the field of English itself to develop varieties or versions of English for learners for simplified communication. The problem being that all of them were the work of one guy sitting down in an armchair and deciding what they themselves thought would work, rather than going out and finding what really works in English as an international language. So the implications are that what's natural and frequent in native speaker usage is not necessarily useful in the classroom. So samples from native speaker corpora are not exactly good examples. So here we might rephrase the notion of authenticity as used not by native speakers, but as used by experts in the relevant domain. For instance, if we have students who want to enter the medical profession and use the English language for that, whether they want to work in Sweden, or whether they want to work in Brazil or any other country where they might want to use the English language, then their models would be nurses, doctors who are successful in using the language without necessarily, of course, being native speakers. In conclusion, for successful ELF communication, we have in mind comprehensibility and intercultural communication being effective, not necessarily being native-like. And then we may also have students who want to learn English as used as a native language and to approximate native-like grammar, pronunciation, style, lexis, and so on, but they will typically have a very special purpose for learning the language, whereas for the majority, these native models might not be relevant. I'm not necessarily saying that we should always encourage informed constructions, but rather, given that we have limited contact time, we should offer learners a choice between so-called inner circle varieties of English, so those that are used by native-speaking countries, and English used for international communication. Then given that we always, as teachers, need to cut some corners in the classroom, knowing what works and what doesn't work in international communication can help us both select items in the syllabus and sequence those. This information may also come useful in correcting errors so that you don't spill red ink all over the page, but just focus on those items that the learner can acquire and that are the most important at a given stage of their development. And linguistic competence ought to be complemented with those strategic competences that we mentioned before, such as intercultural communicative competence, accommodation skills, building a rapport. There are obviously also implications for translation and interpreting if the audience are non-native users. And this could be summed up in a nutshell by saying that the message ought to be maximally clear and typically less idiomatic than you might want for native speaker audiences. So I'd like to finish off by reenacting a conversation that took place between a hotel guest and room service somewhere in Southeast Asia. And you will observe how the native guest did not really cope well in that situation. So the conversation went more or less like this. Morning, room service. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I dialed room service. Right, room service. Morning. Do you wish to order something? Yes, I like some bacon and eggs. How'd you like them? What? Eggs. How'd you like them? Fry, boil, poached? Oh, the eggs. How do I like them? Sorry, scrambled, please. How'd you like the bacon? Crisp? Crisp will be fine. Okay. And Santos? What? Santos. Do you like Santos? I don't know. I don't think so. No, judo on toes. Look, I feel really bad about this, but I don't know what judo on toes means. Toes. Why judo on toes? How about English mopping with butter? English muffin. I've got it. I understand now. You were saying toast. Fine. An English muffin would be just fine. With butter? No, just put the butter on the side. What? I'm sorry, I meant butter. Please put the butter on the side. Copy. I feel terrible about this, but copy. Tea, milk, coffee. Yes, coffee, please. And that's all. 1 minute. Do you order strangled eggs, crisp bacon, English mopping with butter, honey, side, and copy, right? Whatever you say. Okay, thank you very much. You're welcome. And thank you very much for your attention. Dankegon, and I'll be happy to take any comments, questions, criticism in the discussion. Thank you.
Language, for example, for a Polish man and for a Chinese, as the last conversation showed that the different variation of this English, international English or English as a lingua franca has some problems in the world. But thank you very much for this presentation, which gave us insight to the problems and how to prepare students to avoid some of the problems.
Thank you.
Thank you. And for the plenary session, we don't have a special session of questions, or Mathieu, there is some questions. Yes, there is something. There is a question. Can you see it?
All right, yes. So the question I can see is, yep, thanks, it's up there. English as lingua franca is not called a variety for, well, at least two reasons. So one reason is that a variety refers, as an ethno-socio-political construct, refers to the kind of language that is spoken in a given geographical area, and typically by speakers who share also some cultural background. Occasionally there may be more criteria. And this, of course, is different from communication in English as lingua franca, because that happens when either I go out of my community and, let's say, travel somewhere, and there I use the English language to communicate because I can't use my mother tongue Polish. There's no longer this common denominator of the shared geographic territory and shared culture. Or again, someone from another community comes over here, and then again we don't share that background and culture. And the second reason is that English as a lingua franca is not one single kind of English. This is a common misunderstanding, and this is very important to emphasize, that English as a lingua franca always refers to the English as it emerges or is used in a given communicative event. If we have speaker A and speaker B on a Monday having a conversation, and then speaker B and speaker C having a conversation with someone else that day, and then the first two speakers having a conversation a day later, then on each occasion that English is going to be, or maybe, or is likely to be slightly different, and in each case it is going to be English as a lingua franca. So if we want to use a term to refer to all those instances and to speakers who engage in this communication, the best idea or concept is that of communities of practice. So persons engaging in a certain activity with a common goal, or alternatively discourse communities, although discourse communities assumes that the language that is being used has more in common among the speakers, and that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. That's why it's sort of the second choice out there. But communities of practice, or alternatively discourse communities, would be those terms that could be helpful here. All right, let's look at more questions. Okay, I can see the question saying, I've already heard the proposal that ELF teaching should be less focused on native English many years ago, but I've never seen it put into practice. Are there any institutions that promote this? So I'm not sure of official lines or official policies that would state, let's say in the declaration, that we encourage or focus on English as a lingua franca. But if you look at a different phenomenon, that is the phenomenon of translanguaging across different countries today, and more schools picking up on that and actually making that part of their policies, then this in a way means that they are allowing in communication in language that's not native English, right? So this is one way in which we might try to go around looking at schools that don't focus or don't have that native speaker model in mind. There are some countries that I don't want to name specifically that are very opposed to the idea, and where the model of a native speaker teacher is very strong, and where actually you will not be hired to be a teacher of English if you're not coming from the inner circle countries. But I think that especially in countries that are more multicultural and multilingual, there's a growing realization that the native model is not necessarily the only model out there, especially as they often have English language teachers who don't come from that very country and who don't come from native speaking countries, but who are non-native speakers from yet other countries, and they teach the language in those schools. So maybe it's not so often visible on paper in policy documents, but it's certainly out there, although there's still a lot of room for improvement, and a lot more can be done to counter this, these ideologies of native speakerism. Right, and then which English should people try to imitate? Well, I would first of all be against the notion of imitation, because what happens with English as it is learned by many students is that they try to pick bits and pieces of what they will need for their communication, and then work their way around the rest. So there will be many speakers who want to preserve a vestige of their own identity, because they don't want to pass off for an American or a Briton or a Canadian or an Australian, but they want to be seen as persons who come from the country that they come from. So they will make it obvious, even if they have the time to theoretically expand the effort and to approximate native models. So I would say that the English that you want to aim at is the one that will serve you best in the circumstances that you will need to navigate. And then for different students, these are going to be, of course, different, but we must remember that unless you have students who want to integrate into the target community, or who want to move into the target community and live there for some time and also pass off for native speakers, or who want a very high level of proficiency for other reasons. For instance, they may be translators, interpreters, linguistics instructors, foreign language major instructors, actors, and so on, where they will want to be able to approximate native model varieties. Otherwise, most learners today will sometimes speak to a Briton, maybe sometimes to an American, and maybe more often than that, they will speak to a Korean and a Brazilian and an Algerian, and using English in that communication. right? And then the question of whether they try to learn British English or American English or Australian English is no longer relevant. Right. I can't see more questions here in the chat.
Yes, there is no more time for questions. Thank you very much once more also for the answers, and we have to go on with the next topic.